Hey guys, in today's video I want to discuss a very interesting Scrabble pre-endgame that was sent to me a few weeks ago by longtime expert David Pearl. The main reason I find this pre-endgame so interesting is that the optimal play in theory may not actually be the optimal play in practice, and you guys will see what I mean by that a little bit later in the video. Now let's set the stage. It's currently David's turn. He's holding a rack of BELMORZ, and he's down by 62 points to his opponent, another longtime expert, John Shreve. John has just dropped his F for 20 points with of and F, and that left 2 tiles in the bag from David's perspective. From David's point of view, there are 9 tiles unseen, and those tiles, as you can see on the right, are an A, 3 Ds, an I, an N, an O, an S, and a T. Now, where this gets interesting, of course, is David does not know of these 9 tiles which 2 are in the bag, and which 7 are on John's rack. Now, obviously, David is at a significant disadvantage here by virtue of being down 62 points. So, David is probably not going to be likely to win whatever he does, but he needs to figure out how to at least give himself the best chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. So, how can he do that? There are sort of 2 conceivable ways that David could come back and win this game. One of these ways is to make a very high-scoring play that's not a bingo, and the other way is to bingo. Now, given that David has a Z, the first of these ways initially might seem more likely, since of course the Z is worth 10 points, so you can score a lot of points with it, with a shorter word, but it's relatively hard to bingo with. However, the problem is, if we look at this board more closely, there's really nowhere that David can use his Z for a significant number of points. And also not really a good way that he can try to set up his Z that John couldn't very easily block. So that pretty much leaves David only one potential path to victory, namely trying to bingo. Now that's of course going to be easier said than done because he has not only the Z but also the B and the M. David has no available bingos on this turn. After all, if he did, then there wouldn't really be much of a video here. So he needs to figure out how he can play off some tiles and leave himself the best chance to bingo on his next turn. Now, right off the bat, we observe that David's play must consist of either 1 or 2 tiles, because if David plays more than 2 tiles, then with only 2 in the bag, he's going to end up with an incomplete rack of fewer than 7 tiles on his next turn, and of course, with less than 7 tiles on his rack, he is not going to be able to bingo. So David's got to either play 1 or 2 tiles, and which of those should he do? Well, at first it might seem that David should try to play just 1 tile, because if David plays 2 tiles, he's going to empty the bag. And if David empties the bag, then John, through his tile tracking, is going to know exactly what David's final rack is. And that means that unless David has bingos that play in 2 different parts of the board that John can't simultaneously block, John is going to be able to block David's bingo and easily hold on and win the game. So if David empties the bag and plays 2 tiles here, he's got to count on drawing a bingo in not 1 but 2 different spots, significantly increasing his burden. And on the other hand, if David only plays 1 tile, then he doesn't necessarily have to draw something in 2 spots, because then there's still going to be 1 tile left in the bag on John's turn. And because of that, John is not going to know for certain what David's rack is. In fact, there are going to be up to 8 different possible racks David could still have. So with that uncertainty, if theoretically from John's perspective, David is threatening bingos in multiple spots, John might elect to block the wrong spot. He might block a spot that he thinks is more dangerous, but given what David has, it's actually not the one he should have blocked, and David ends up bingoing out elsewhere and winning the game. That is a common theme in Scrabble where, generally speaking, if you can, in these kind of positions, you want to try to leave your opponent some uncertainty by leaving at least 1 tile in the bag. So, again, it would seem that David should try to play just 1 tile here. However, there's a problem. David, for one, cannot play just his Z. So if he plays 1 tile, he's going to have to keep his Z, and the Z, of course, is not a tile that's easy to bingo with. It turns out that there's only one way David can fish off 1 tile and give himself any chance whatsoever at a playable bingo, and that's to play off his L with something like ball for 5 points. If he does this and draws the I, he's going to be threatening bromise and slope. However, the problem with this, and I won't go through all the details, is that if he draws the I, then regardless of what other tile is in the bag, then John is going to see that line as the statistically most likely bingo threat. So John is going to, assuming he plays optimally, block that spot on his next turn. That's in part due to, depending on what's in the bag, bromide or bromine in the same spot also being potential threats John might have to worry about. So again, I won't go through all of the permutations, but in this case, the logic behind leaving one in the bag, namely leaving some uncertainty for John, is going to fail because John's best play is unequivocally going to be to block that spot, and David won't get to play his out bingo even if he draws it. So interesting idea here, but that is not going to work. And thus David has to play off 2 tiles. And that means, like I said, he's got to draw a playable bingo in 2 spots of the board that John cannot simultaneously block. That's going to be tough to do. It turns out that there are actually 3 different plays here that give David a non-zero chance to win this game, assuming optimal play from John. In other words, assuming that if David does indeed only have 1 bingo, that John is going to block it. There are 3 ways here that David can at least give himself some chance at drawing an unblockable out bingo. And I'll give you guys a chance if you want to pause the video and see if you are able to find any of these. I would say one of these 3 plays is considerably easier to find than the others. So for those of you who found one of those plays, excellent job. And the 3 plays, I'll go over all of them in detail, are zoo. This, I believe, is the easiest one and the one I initially found. Then you have also says up here from the S in votarus. And finally, I think by far the hardest one to find, nom, for just 6 points from the N in Reading. These all win just 1 in 36 times. So pretty slim, but hey, 1 in 36 is better than 0. So now let me explain when and how each of these plays win. I'll start with zoo for 22. This play is going to win if David draws specifically an A and an S out of the bag. This occurs 1 out of 36 times because with 9 tiles in the bag and David drawing 2 tiles, there are 9 choose 2 or 36 different 2-tile draws he could have, and there is just one that's an A and an S because there is a single A and single S in the bag. Now, why does this win if David draws an A and an S? Well, if he does, then he's going to be threatening marbles and slops and also gamblers. And it's not too hard to see that John is not going to be able to block both of these. So if David does indeed hit his draw, then John, with this rack, isn't going to have all that much he can do. He might play something like Doit for 15, after which David bingos out with marbles, winning the game easily 440 to 413. Now, of course, I mentioned that zoo is one of 3 plays that give David that 1 in 36 chance to win. And another one is says up here. This one wins not with an AS draw, but with an IS draw. And that's because if David draws IS, he's going to be threatening the word nombrils from an N in 2 spots, from the N in grants and from the N in Reading. And once again, John is not going to be able to make a play that simultaneously obstructs both of these. This time, if David hits his IS draw, John is going to have this rack. And it's pretty easy to see he's not going to be able to block both placements of nombrils. His best play here would involve blocking the higher scoring one from the N in Reading, with a play like do for 10 points, but this is going to fall well short as David's 66-point nombrils is still more than enough and he wins 434 to 408. David's third, and I think by far the hardest to see, play that gives himself a non-zero chance of victory is, like I mentioned before, nom for 6. I think this is the hardest to see because it involves keeping the normally troublesome Z for bingoing. And this, just like zoo, is going to win if and only if David draws an A and an S, because then he's going to be threatening the word blazers in 2 spots. Next to slop making slops and hooking nom making gnome, both of these plays are going to score 79 points. And John is once again going to be unable to block both of these. So after nom, we might see a play like Tandi from John on the bottom, and then David bingos out with blazers and gnome, and is going to eclipse John, winning this one 429 to 414. So that concludes all of the plays that, again, assuming optimal play from his opponent, are going to give David a mathematical chance to win the game. David did not make any of these 3 plays, but David won the game. And the play David made here is fascinating because, again, it never wins assuming theoretically optimal play from his opponent, but if his opponent doesn't play properly, it actually wins far more often than any of the 1 in 36 wins we just talked about. Let me explain how. First, let me explain what David did. He played or for 11 points in the top right corner, keeping the bizarre-looking BELMZ. So what was David up to here? Well, let me show you how this game concluded. Like I said, David played or for 11, and he drew an A and a D out of the bag, leaving John with a rack of DDINOST. John, not really thinking there was much of a threat with David having BMZD on his rack, played dints and slops for 14 points. And then, bam, David slaps down Emblazed as an out bingo for 100, easily winning the game 453 to 412. So, what just happened here? How did David pull this off? Well, if we go back a turn, he pulled this off because he drew Emblazed as a possible bingo, and John failed to block it. Instead of playing dints here, John wins this game easily if he blocks Emblazed with even a simple play such as do for 10 points. So why did John not block it? It's not that John didn't know the word, it's that he simply saw BMZ, a bunch of normally clunky looking tiles on David's rack, and assumed that David wasn't going to bingo. It's a mistake that even strong experts have made all too often, and I think it's just human nature. You see all those tiles and you think, how the heck could they bingo? And you don't really look quite as hard as you maybe should, and you just assume that you're going to cruise to a victory, and unfortunately you get stunned with a 100-point out bingo. Like I said, not trying to be critical of John here at all, it happens to everybody. But the interesting thing here is that while David's play of or, of course, always loses if John reacts properly, it actually wins more often, far more often, than the 1 in 36 if John does not react properly. Why? Let's go back to the unseen tile pool when David played or. So after his play of or, keeping BELMZ, David is going to hit Emblazed if he draws an A and a D. Well, guess what? There are 3 Ds left, so David draws AD much more often than the 1 in 36 he draws AS or IS. He's going to hit AD not 1 in 36, but 3 in 36. And in addition, if David draws AS, he is going to have Emblazes, and that likewise has the potential to win if John decides not to block it. So there's actually 4 out of 36 probability that David hits a bingo from the eye in Reading. So he's 4 times as likely to be threatening an out bingo there as he is to have a guaranteed winning out bingo in any of the other lines. So what that means, theoretically, is if David thinks there's at least a 25% chance that John messes up and doesn't block Emblazed or Emblazes, then he should actually play or. And this is where things get very interesting and honestly pretty much impossible to answer from a psychological standpoint. Is John more than 25% to commit the gaffe he did during the game and not notice that David is threatening an out bingo and block it? Again, it's impossible to say. Obviously, if David were playing Nigel Richards, then the chances would be 0, basically, and David should not play this gambit, and he should instead go for one of his 1 in 36 Hail Mary plays we talked about earlier. If David is playing a much weaker player, or a beginner, he probably should go for this gambit. I think a lot of weaker players would make the same assumption John did, and just look at those tiles and think, well, there's no way he's bingoing. John, like I said, is certainly not at the level of a top expert like Nigel Richards, but he's certainly no beginner. He's been a longtime expert ranked inside the top 100 in North America for many, many years. So it's kind of a gray area. I honestly don't know myself what I would have done here. Clearly, David's gambit paid off, given what he drew out of the bag, AD. None of the theoretical optimal plays in the original position here where he played or would have worked, and his play of or worked very well. Of course, if David had played or and then drew something like IS, then he could have very much came to regret this decision instead of playing something like says, drawing that unblockable nombrils in 2 spots. So really, really hard to say. And before I close, another point I should make. The fact that John's last play was of, dropping just the F, actually makes it even more likely that David is going to draw Emblazed after or, and less likely that he's going to draw one of his needed pools, either AS or IS, after one of his 1 in 36 wins like Zoo. Because I think it's very rare that John would make this play if he had all 3 Ds on his rack. He probably would have just played a D in the same spot, which would have been an 8-point sacrifice, but the last thing you want to do is keep 3 Ds on your rack. So does that make it impossible that John has all 3 Ds, either before his play or after his play? No, but it makes it significantly less likely, and as a result, that makes at least one of the Ds significantly more likely to still be in the bag. Again, not a guarantee by any means that there's a D in the bag, but all else being equal, it even further increases the chance that one of the Ds is in the bag. So that, of course, would decrease David's chance at drawing something like AS, and increase David's chance at drawing AD after his play of OR. So, in reality, David's odds of winning after a play like Zoo might be less than 1 in 36, and his odds of drawing Emblazed or Emblazes after OR might realistically be more than 4 out of 36. So maybe the breaking point isn't actually John being 25% or more to make that mistake. Maybe it's less. Maybe it's only 20%. Maybe it's even only 10 or 15%. It's very hard to know the exact number, since it's hard to gauge how strong the inference is exactly. How unlikely is it really that John would have played his last move of while keeping 3 Ds, or maybe keeping 2 Ds and drawing the third on his 1-tile pool? How unlikely is it really that John is going to mess up and not block David's out bingo? These are both extremely subjective things, and honestly impossible to quantify with any sort of certainty when you are playing against a human who is not Nigel Richards and who is certainly not infallible. And that's, I think, one underrated aspect of Scrabble, guys. Even though it's a very quantitative game in a lot of respects, there are a lot of other aspects of the game that simply cannot be quantified precisely. If you asked me straight up here, Mac, what should David have done? The only correct answer would be, I don't know. And not only that, but we can't know. And what I think is really cool about this position in particular is that there are not 1, but 2 layers that can't be quantified. One of them is the inference layer. How much more likely, if at all, does John's last play of make it that at least one of the Ds is in the bag? I think it makes it somewhat more likely, but it's impossible to know exactly how much more likely. And even if somehow you were able to figure that out, which to the best of my knowledge you can't, again, you still have the uncertainty of how likely is John really to block if David hits his draw after his play of OR. Even if David somehow was able to quantify the inference part, let's say hypothetically he knew that he should play OR if John was at least 15% to make a mistake and not block, how on earth is he supposed to guess whether John is 15% or more to not block? Again, there are extremes. Like if David were playing Best Spot or Nigel Richards, then the odds of them not blocking are probably pretty close to 0. If David were playing a beginner, then those odds are much higher. John is somewhere in between those 2 extremes, as are basically all experienced tournament Scrabble players. And how is David supposed to know what the percentage is in John's particular case? Again, I'm certainly not a professional psychologist, but I don't believe there is a mathematical way to quantify that. So 2 different layers here that I believe are impossible to quantify. So again, the correct answer to what should David have done here is legitimately, we don't know. It worked out in this case. Was it correct theoretically? Maybe, maybe not. And while that is a little bit unsatisfying in a way, I think it's also really cool that this game can leave ourselves with a lot of uncertainty and a lot to talk about. So speaking of a lot to talk about, that's about all I'm going to say here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Would you have done what David did? Would you have gone for one of your 1 in 36 theoretical wins? What do you think he should have done? What do you think about this whole concept? Really curious to hear you guys' thoughts. Thanks as always for watching the video and supporting my channel. I really appreciate it. Thanks again to David for sending me this position to analyze. Have a great rest of your day, guys, and I will see you soon for the next video. Bye-bye.